Hey, good morning. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes. So about 5 minutes we will get started. Thank you. All right. Good morning. I have to check my watch to make sure it's still morning. I don't even know what time it is. Thank you, Therese. Welcome to our second workshop today on attainable and resilient housing. The focus of this session is on land use policy and innovative solutions. And before we get into some introductions and get started, I do want to share a few things about the context of what we're trying to accomplish today. First is this is being streamed live. And so we have folks joining us virtually. It's also being recorded. It's also a public meeting, so we will have public comment at the end. And so you all have microphones in front of you, so please push the button and so it goes from red to green before you speak. So our folks on Zoom, and then hold it close to your mouth so they can hear you. We also have we're going to touch on what it means to be a branch member in a little bit, but we have branch members here in person and branch members that are joining us virtually from the Recovery Task Force. And so branch members in person, just you can come off mute. When you have questions, it's supposed to be a dialogue with the panelists. And then for folks, the branch members and panelists that are joining us virtually, if you have comments or questions, please drop them into the chat, and we are monitoring the chat in real time. For panelists that are on Zoom, we just ask you to use the raise hand function so we can make sure that we see you, and we'll be monitoring that. So the other thing I want to say is this is about solutions. This is we're really trying to we know the impact that the hurricane had on our community. It also created an opportunity for us to think about the long term of how do we build a more resilient Lee County. And so this is really solutions focused. Maybe we've done things in the past we can revisit. Maybe there are opportunities for things we can do now, or communities are doing things now that we can scale. So the goal is solutions, solutions, solutions. So that might mean we have some gaps we've identified that we need to understand more, but the goal is to get to solutions. So with that, we're going to do some quick introductions, and we will get the party started. So my name is John Romine. I'm part of the team here at Collaboratory, also part of the support team for the Recovery Task Force, helping move this along. We'll touch on that a little bit more once we get through introductions. So Steve, we'll start with you. Just name an organization, and then we'll get to the folks on Zoom at the end.
Good morning, everyone. Steve Belden, Community Development Director, City of Fort Myers.
Good morning, Frank Wells, President, Bright Community Trust.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mary Gibbs. I'm Community Development Director with the Village of Estero. Village people. Yay.
Paula McMichael. I'm the Director of Planning for the City of Sanibel.
Amy Yearsley, City Planning Manager for the City of Cape Coral.
Jason Crage, GIS Coordinator, Lee County Human and Veteran Services.
Ellison Taylor, LSI Companies.
Terry Ware, Senior Manager, Haggerty Consulting.
And I believe we have 4 joining us on Zoom. And then Tam, go ahead and grab a seat at the end. We'll have you introduce yourself here in a minute. We'll start with you, Brett, because you're at the very top.
Sounds good. Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Brett Pelletier. I'm with Kirk & Company Real Estate Counselors out of Boston, Massachusetts. Very simply a housing economist working in housing solutions across the country.
Jacqueline?
Good morning, Jacqueline Ginston. I am the Planning and Zoning Manager for Bonita Springs.
And Brandon.
Good morning, Brandon Dunn with Community Development for Lee County.
Is that it, Alani? One more? Is Kara on or no?
Hi, I'm on. I'm Kara Sarah. I'm with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. I'm the Principal Resiliency Planner for the council.
Great, thank you. And Tam, if you can do a quick intro.
Tamara Pygott with the Lee County Visitor and Convention Bureau.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to have a facilitated conversation for the next couple hours. And this one last introduction. I cannot forget my partner in crime here, Harrison Newton from Haggerty Consulting, and the critical role that he plays in this long-term recovery effort.
Sure, I'm Harrison Newton. I work for Haggerty, as he just said, and just happy to be part of the Resilient Lee support team. We've been working to support this workshop effort, as well as the branches and the task force too. So thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Harrison. I told you I wasn't going to forget, and I did. All right, so high level overview of the Recovery Task Force. So Recovery Task Force are created after disasters across the country. It's based on a FEMA framework, and our task force is led and chaired by the County Commission. Commissioner Kevin Ruane is the chairman for the task force. And then the remaining 12 members of the task force are made up of the elected entities within Lee County. So that includes the municipalities, law enforcement, the fire districts, the school board, the health system, a representative from our legislative delegation, as well as a constitutional officer. So that is what makes up the Recovery Task Force. In addition to that, the Recovery Task Force has 8 branches. And so those branches are planning and capacity. So that's really looking at the higher level countywide policy opportunities and changes that may be helpful, economic recovery, education and workforce, health and social services, infrastructure, housing, which is chaired by or led by Gary Griffin, natural resources and cultural resources. And so all of these working together to really start to make up what the Recovery Task Force looks like and this idea of creating a resiliency plan. So we've been on a bit of a, we'll stick with the word aggressive, timeline since the late February, early March. And for the past 3 months, we've really been collecting information, trying to understand what are these initial priority areas that folks have identified, whether it's the branch members, which are made up from the community engagement efforts that have taken place in the last couple of months, as well as what technical expertise we have at the local government level. Like what are all of the things that people are starting to prioritize as a result of the hurricane, but thinking about long-term resilience for our community as a whole. So not just hurricane recovery and hurricane response, but long-term resilience for Lee County. We're moving into this solutions phase where we're developing the recovery and resiliency plan, which will go ultimately to the Board of County Commissioners for a vote on December 5th. And so really what we're trying to build towards are these solutions and these initiatives and these ideas of how do we make Lee County more resilient is the goal of what this phase that we are in now. Related to community engagement, it was a robust effort. Many of you participated. And so we hosted a total of 17 town halls. 2 of them were virtual, one in English and one in Spanish. And then we had 15 town halls throughout the planning communities in Lee County to really start to understand what folks in the community, because you know the community was hit differently in different parts, but what are those priorities when we really start talking about and thinking about long-term resilience? And so we had a little over 1,000 folks participated in that. And then we have an online survey that's still live at resiliently.com that if you haven't filled it out or you know folks that would like to, please share that. It will be live for a little bit longer still. And we've had almost 5,000 people participate in that and share their input on what we should be prioritizing specifically to Lee County as part of this process. And then lastly, on March 30th, there was a region-wide, so including 4 other counties, Charlotte, Collier, Henry, and Glades counties, on the table sessions. And these were a day-long effort to have conversations around what are the things we can do or what are the things we need to prioritize as a community, and what are those social issues and those challenges that we need to really be focusing on. And no surprise, in every single one of those ways we've captured information, housing is the number one priority in our community. And I will say it was, if not number 1, it was number 2 before the storm, whether it's a workforce challenge, whether it's an economic development challenge, whether it's a tourism challenge, whether it's, we can go on and on and on, but it's definitely one of the biggest challenges that not just our community is facing, but communities across the country. And so today, housing gets its own whole day. So this week has been all about workshops. And so we started on Monday, we kicked off the week with critical infrastructure. So the only infrastructure conversation we haven't had is around the power infrastructure. That will be hosted on June 21st at 2:00 here at Collaboratory. And then on Wednesday, we talked about supporting business and workforce. Guess what? Housing came up in that. And then yesterday, we talked all about community resilience. And then today is attainable and resilient housing. And the goal of the workshop, so the branches have been identifying opportunities or priorities or things that they want a little bit more information about. So you all are the subject matter experts, the panelists here on the left, around certain pieces of this puzzle around housing for Lee County specifically. We do know housing is a regional challenge. We do know we're not going to solve our housing challenge with only focusing on Lee County, but the Recovery Task Force itself is primarily focused on Lee County. And so today really is intended to be a dialogue. So branch members and panelists is to have a conversation to really understand how we can get more information for the solutions to solve our housing challenges in Lee County. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Terry, and he's going to dive a little bit deeper on what this conversation will be about.
Thanks. We have a lot of the excellent panelists from this morning still here, so I'm not going to repeat myself. You know, I showed this diagram earlier and I focused when we were talking about the financial on the interaction between that and the market. But now when we're talking about public policy, land use, transportation, infrastructure, how it's built, where it's built, it really gets into this issue about community vision. Because I hope I don't offend anyone, the role of a politician is to get reelected. And so on, you know, we've got the phases of development. And then overlaid of that, we've got the 2 or 4 year cycle of the political environment. I want to get reelected. If I'm really representing the interest of the individuals in my community, what vision is it that we're talking about? Because that vision is what's then developed into the development regulations, land use, etc., that you know, determine what's going to happen on any individual parcel. But it's a reflection of community desire. You know, there we go. What role should government play? What does the community desire? And then as we talked about this morning, what will the market support? And what does the property owner want? So, all right, we changed the zoning. Now as the property owner, most property owners are not generally good developers, but you've upzoned. Okay, now I'm going to make a whole lot of money, you know, and I'm going to sell it. Developer comes in and says, yeah, I'll pay that amount of money. Now I've got to go to the city or the county, get development approved. So I'm working with the city council. You know, we're 2 years into the process. You know, I've worked with the staff, the planning directors on board. Election cycle. Everything comes to a halt. Now what are we going to do? Now we've got, you know, perhaps new people who've moved into the community. I tell you, I worked in Hawaii for 4 years in Honolulu on transit-oriented development. And several times I was told, go back where you came from, because we moved here for a particular lifestyle and we don't want changes that are going to impact that lifestyle. And the elected official, right, new mayor comes in and says, well, you know, I got elected by this block of people over here who didn't like that. So, you know, this interaction of public policy with community desires, you know, we talked a lot about this stuff, so I'm not going to repeat myself this morning, but I just want to put that frame in place. And then let's talk about what typically has been done in other communities. Density is most often used tool to encourage multifamily or affordable housing development. All right, now we're back to the community vision. I moved to this community because it was low scale and big open skies. You're going to build a 3-story housing unit behind me. I thought it was interesting, not to go off on a tangent. Stephen Curry, who plays for the Warriors, and his wife live in Atherton, California. They signed a petition in objection to a 39-unit senior housing development that was going behind them. I raise that only to say, you know, having worked in Boulder, Colorado, and Berkeley, California, and some very liberal communities, NIMBYism is alive across the country. And that reflects back to our political process. So, you know, we talked about density bonuses. Where is that appropriate? Where can it happen? You know, we've talked about other zoning variances. Typically, it's reducing parking, providing infrastructure. These are sort of the typical ways that other communities have responded in trying to deal with this issue of providing affordable housing. So having said all that, as I ended the last session, it's my belief that out of all of these things, having political consensus about the direction of the community is the most important element, because then you have support for the tools and projects and activities that will move forward. So having said all that, I guess the first question is, what are the barriers that you see in this community to providing incentives for the affordable housing that the community needs? And I think Jennifer this morning mentioned the market, you know, I mean, and others have mentioned, you know, the market, the hole that we're missing is the middle market. You know, there's subsidies for the very low income per se. The market's going to take care of the very high income. And that tends to be where a lot of the development occurs, but it's sort of missing hole. So, you know, we've talked about reduced parking. We've talked about lowering financing costs, modular, different construction techniques. but all of that still has to occur in the political environment in which we exist. So the first question is, what is the political environment here? And is there support within the communities for the kind of housing that, is so sorely needed? Anyone want to jump into that, that hole? Don't raise your hands all at once. Jennifer, I thought you had some good comments this morning, so I'm going to pick on you.
Nothing like being put on the spot.
Right. Yeah,
Good morning, everyone. What we were referring to a little bit was just context. Southwest Florida was not necessarily a planned development for all the things that we look at when we look at planning. It comes from a marketing perspective of selling the American dream, of the retired dream, of a vacation destination. And when you develop a town around that, that is mostly a suburban planned development, speaking specifically in regards to Cape Coral, to just kind of drive a nexus of what the conversation happened about earlier, is that we are now at an opportunity to provide potential solutions to a planning process that lacked the planning process, but was most likely more marketing focused. We have a lot of folks here that have come to maintain that dream, just like you were saying, having a vacation home, rather than looking at the support needed to have that dream. And when it comes to workforce, whether it comes to the infrastructure, whether it comes to where you buy your food, where we grow our food, what our houses or our house products look like in Cape Coral, specifically in coast development along Southwest Florida, most of our housing or our development was around a retirement or a vacation destination. So we have an opportunity to fix that. And that was just some of the context of this morning, is kind of understanding where we came from to where we are now, and the problems that we have and the solutions that we can gather, knowing what we know now and all the people that are at the table. So just setting context. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So I know there are
So
several planning directors.
I'll
Go
jump
ahead,
in from,
in.
at
Thank
least
you.
from the city of Fort Myers perspective, barriers. And we're seeing not necessarily barriers to the development of affordable housing specifically, but barriers to development of housing in particular, regardless. There's been a lot of development pressure. Southwest Florida, Lee County, city of Fort Myers, we're all experiencing that development pressure in housing in particular. We've seen an explosion of multifamily developments in the city of Fort Myers, the vast majority market rate, luxury apartments in the city. And that's put a lot of pressure on our infrastructure system. And so people are responding to that. It's affecting real lives as far as, we've had water pressure issues, you have traffic, you have transportation issues. So we're getting pushed back just on development in general. No more residential development. That's what, we're hearing. And so we talk about incentives, we talk about density bonuses. Yeah, that's a great incentive, but we got pushback on that. And it's not just not because it's necessarily affordable housing, because it's just more people. So that's what kind of what we're facing right now, is especially the last couple of years, kind of through COVID, it's really picked up with a lot of people that kind of moved down here or stayed here through the summer months, when usually you get that kind of seasonal break. Well, and now more and more people are coming here and putting more and more pressure on the systems that we have here. So it's, like I said, it's more of just a pushback on those development pressures.
It's an interesting kind of dilemma that we're in these days, isn't it? We've crossed the Rubicon into the remote world. So as Tom Friedman mentioned in his book, The World is Flat, there are two kinds of jobs: local jobs, barber, doctor, stylist, those things that require face-to-face interaction. And then there are everything else. And so in communities like this, where you have a high sense of a place value, if you will, I want to live here because of the, adjacency to water and the great climate, you have those remote people, and now they're putting pressure on the service industry, which is the other end of the spectrum. And so, from your perspective, how are you addressing this? What do you think the community vision is in line with the new economy? Anyone jump in?
I didn't want to start the conversation because I know Sanibel is a little bit different
Right.
And that it's entirely barrier island. The market pressures that we see regionally are even greater on Sanibel. People who can afford to live there can price out basically everybody else. We do have a below market rate housing program, and it is targeted towards 160% of area median income. So
Hang on, did you say 160? 60? Okay, just wanted to make sure I heard that correctly.
yes. So that middle there, it's not even the 120% that other people are talking about. We're looking at people who make a good deal of money. And that what you talked about, the remote economy and people being able to work remotely, we have seen a lot of people who move to Sanibel. There's a great school out on Sanibel. They want their kids to go to a great school. They want to live in a beautiful place, and they can work remotely. They don't have to. They can be from California and continue to work for that same company, but now they live on Sanibel. So that just increases that pressure.
It's that beautiful place issue. What's the community desire that drives people to make these location decisions? Go ahead, jump in.
I think with what we're seeing is, I think Cape Coral is always seeing explosive growth, and we kind of want to, we're having a hard time. We've always kind of had a hard time figuring out what we want to be when we grow up. And we're just starting to get there and understand we don't want to just be a bedroom community. So how can we get other types of development so our residents don't have to leave Cape Coral, but at the same time, we're starting to see kind of a slow growth, anti-growth idea as the roads fill up, as they realize, wow, we only have one hospital for Cape Coral. And so in fact, Wednesday, even at council, someone actually came and said, you should stop issuing permits for single family homes. Well, we know we can't do that, right? And it's very hard to get the average person. They said, we don't want to be Miami. Well, it's very hard to get the average person to understand that, the concept of vested rights of development and things like that. So, we are always kind of trying to look at ways to incorporate our community values, but understand that we are just rapidly growing and there's no stopping us. We know that we're going to be 430,000 people. And we're going to get there faster than we ever anticipated.
Tam, before you jump in, I know Jacqueline had her hand up on Zoom. Kind of want to get the perspective, I believe, from Bonita Springs on what was said earlier. And then Tam, I definitely want to hear the tourism aspect as it relates to this.
Thank you. My input in terms of a barrier that I have seen is the impact of the short-term rental market on our community. We've had recently a lot of multifamily developments come online, which is nice, which was great for our workforce. We're just outside of Collier County, so we served a lot of residential needs for the workforce in Collier. But even then, some of those developments are now wanting to be used for short-term rentals. So we're seeing a lot of the short-term rental market impact the housing that was available for our workforce, to the point where now Bonita is not really affordable for some people anymore. So that's just something I wanted to share that I've been seeing in terms of a barrier for attainable housing for the workforce. So that's all.
Great, thank you.
I'll build into that a little bit. I think that, a lot of retirees are using or future retirees to our area are using vacation rentals as a way to pay to fund that. They're buying now, they're renting it short term and plan to eventually live in that property. And so it may feel like it's the tourism industry that's placing that pressure, but really it's that future retiree that's placing that pressure on that unit. How many shows on HGTV, buy your vacation home and rent it out, right? So it's a philosophy. I think the challenge for our community, and I hear what you say about, marketing driving this. We always had affordable housing. There was always another place we could build another single family home in this community. We got good at it. We knew how to permit them. We knew how to design them. We knew how to build them. We had the right construction, all the assets in place were for single family homes and for a lack of density. And so we just kept going, right? Going. Now we're at a different spot. We don't have affordable housing anymore, and we've got to change our philosophy. The one thing I would recommend is, rather than focusing on how we change not only the laws, but how do we change the mindset of our community to understand that some of that density would take pressure off the things that they're objecting to. The reason they don't want more people to come here is they don't want to be in traffic as long as they're in traffic every day. But think about it. If we had employee housing closer to the islands, in places where people didn't have to commute as far and clog the roads as much, that would be very helpful to our community, not only to the people who work there. I mean, do you think they really want a 45-minute commute to work from Lehigh to Sanibel Island? I don't think they do, or an hour and a half commute, depending on the day. You know, that's not what they want. They've got a family they're trying to get home and feed and do all of those things. So if we can start having conversations about, if we did this, these are the relief points that would come as a result of it, I think we would start getting more support within the community.
So Tam, I just want to like take that for Dan's sake, step deeper. So really, we're talking about employment and housing centers around where the jobs are versus maybe what we've done in the past. And it's just an evolution of how our community has developed.
Unfortunately, as the demand for the community, and whatever way that may be, the growth of the community, however you want to say it, everybody wants to be close to the coastline, so the prices are pushed higher and higher. We might change our minds post-DN. I want you to hear me. I know I'm changing my mind, but I do think that that put the pressure points on that. So you've got your workers as far away from the coastline as possible in your communities, coming to serve those communities. And so, yes, we've got to turn this upside down and figure out, there's going to be a million NIMBY conversations, but if you can prove that you can relieve some of those pressure points, I think that conversation can change. And that's where I'd like us to go.
So you picked up, I think when we talk about development, it's really easy for most people to imagine the worst of development. I mean, as a human race, I think we tend to go there. What techniques have other communities used to talk about the best of development? When I worked in Boulder, we did visual preference surveys, where you'd show them, see, it's not, the ghetto that's built here. It's the little 2- and 3-story, it's downtown Fort Myers, with the older buildings and the walkable communities. How do we create positive images of development? How do we do that? I mean, is anyone successful?
I think Kara on Zoom has a suggestion or maybe a potential solution for this as well. And then Mary and Frank will get to you.
I don't have a ton of information about this, especially since I'm not located in Southwest Florida, but in our region in Tampa Bay, our county, Pinellas County, just recently launched basically a compact of different cities and organizations like the transit agency, who are going to work together and have agreed to really focus on affordable housing for that county.
Thank you.
Well, I think I want to talk a little bit about an interesting thing that's going on in Estero right now that kind of brings all this together. We've had the same thing Fort Myers is experiencing with all the apartments and multifamily, and it's an explosion. It feels like every nook and cranny, somebody wants to come in and do apartments, luxury. They're all luxury, of course. I think that means granite countertops or something. But we were a little bit concerned because we've only got 10% vacant land. So we want to reserve some for economic development. So you've got, jobs versus housing, and how do you balance that? So we have in our comprehensive plan, we have like mixed use development scenarios where we try to encourage higher densities, taller heights, with some incentives and density bonuses. And we've got a project that is coming up Tuesday night at my planning and zoning board that will bring all this to fruition. Does it get approved? Will there be higher density? You've got the neighbors next door that don't want the height. We have 2-story. We only want it to be single family. We want it to be condos. We don't like apartments. We don't want mixed use. We're never leaving the site. We don't like the traffic. So all these things are kind of coming to fruition. We, in order to have people understand the densities, we have the applicant do a pattern book, which is really just the architectural, the elevations and the site plan, the design, and that kind of visually shows what it would look like. which is very helpful. It doesn't solve everything because people still might not like it, but it kind of gives you the visual of what you're going to see next door, which takes away some of that concern. So Tuesday night, tune in everybody for the,
Are you asking us to come in person? Is
No.
it- No. Oh, okay. Just want to make sure, Mary. Just make sure we were clear.
Are there other examples that you know about where it's been where you've been successful in portraying the positive aspects of development?
I'll take it on a slight tangent, but
Okay.
I think we got to be able to articulate to people who are leery of development that this is very directly a quality of life issue for you, right? The first thing I say to somebody who says, I don't want anything new in my neighborhood, I go, tell me what your favorite restaurant is. Are they only open 5 days a week now? Yes, doggone it. Nobody wants to work these days. Be willing to bet if you ask the restaurant owner, it's a workforce housing issue. I never thought of that, right? This stuff is quality of life that affects everybody at any income level, no matter where you live. And we've got to be able to connect the dots for people. The other thing I think we need to remind our elected officials of, thought it was very instructive. Orange County had a rent control ordinance. Not going to discuss the value of rent control ordinances, just going to say the vote passed 60-40 in favor, right? People are begging for any kind of help with rent. And so every time there's a county vote, I go to my commissioners and say, can I just remind you that there were 70,000 more voters in favor of doing something about housing affordability than against, but they're at their second or third job, not at the commission meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning on a weekday, right? So when 10 people show up to tell you, we don't want this in our neighborhood, please listen to the other 70,000 people that are begging you to do something about this, right? We've got to keep that in mind.
I can give an example. It's definitely not affordable. It's Tarpon Point. But it is an example of NIMBYism. And Amy, you remember this, when they wanted to develop that, it was definitely, I don't want to look at a high rise. Our property values are going to be devalued. As we sit here, there is currently a 20,000 square foot single family residence being built that stares at a 15-story high rise. So it's a great example of success, and it is a jewel for Cape Coral to have it. It's totally fabulous mixed use. And so I want to go back to Tammy's point. We need to storytell. That's our housing coalition for the collaboratory has a housing storytelling branch. And so I'm using their words. We need to show people why we need these developments. We will get the buy-in of the people that live in these expensive high rises if we say, we need a robust economy and we need housing for all. We have to house our workforce. Can you support us in this? Because the lady that's building the 20,000 square foot living home, she's expecting a certain standard of living when she moves in. That's why she chose Cape Coral, and that's why she chose Southwest Florida. So I think there's an opportunity to break those silos down in NIMBYism, not in the space that I work in. Unfortunately, that I work in the very affordable housing space. That's a little bit of a tougher ask. But in the true attainable workforce space, I really believe this community could rally around that. And we wouldn't have that issue if we just somehow tell the story. In the previous workshop, we talked about mapping what the jobs look like, what those incomes are versus the AMI. That's all a part of that storytelling and getting that message out.
Do you think the challenge is presenting enough technical data, or is it dealing with the emotional side of the issue?
For sure, the emotional side, I think, for sure, because I think we can back up everything with data for, we can say, Harvard has a study on this, your property values won't go down. We've done an analysis of this, but you have to start to control the emotions that people have.
And to me, change is hard, but we're going to change no matter what right now. So this is the perfect opportunity to embrace that change, to push harder to get these things that we all as a community, as leaders within the community, understand need to happen. So, of course there's going to be resistance. I wouldn't expect anything else because, that's what happens. But right now, no matter what, Fort Myers Beach isn't going to be the same as it was before. We acknowledge that. There's no one that's going to be surprised that it's going to be different. So why not embrace these opportunities?
And before we go back to the table, I do know we have both Jacqueline and Brett. So Jacqueline, if you want to go first, and then Brett would love to hear from a national perspective, what you're seeing, opportunities based on what the panel's already discussed and has come from the branches. What are those opportunities are? So Jacqueline and then Brett, and then we'll come back to Steve.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to share our experience with our downtown redevelopment. So the council had decided to go ahead and prepare or retain actually DPZ co-design to help us with our downtown redevelopment, and we adopted a form-based code. We finally have projects that are in the pipeline, so it's very exciting. But what they did as part of that process is there was a lot of diagrams and illustrations to help illustrate density and kind of have that discussion to educate the people what density can look like, that high density can look attractive. And so that was great. Their information was used to help go ahead and adopt a comprehensive plan map and text amendment to where we have 20 dwelling units an acre within our entire downtown redevelopment area. And then the density is further implemented as part of our form-based code, which is then divided into transects. And then within certain transects to address what I will call, or what DPZ also was calling the missing middle, which would target our attainable housing discussion, is, you know, these really unique developments called cottage court designs, where you have these different types of single family cottages all on these tracts of land, where they could range between 10 to 15 dwelling units an acre. We also implemented accessory dwelling unit policies to the point where accessory dwelling units of a certain size did not count towards your density, would not count towards requiring impact fee assessments and collections. We also established what we called an equivalent residential unit. So units of a certain size, you know, just think of studios. So depending on the square footage, it could be a 1 for 3 or a 1 for 2. And those were some of the things that we did to help, you know, address attainable housing, and also kind of have that discussion on, you know, density is not really a bad word, you know, if it's designed properly. And the amendments have passed. And like I said, we have some projects underway and it's very exciting. We're going to have our first multifamily building, hopefully picking up their building permit soon. And then we have another cottage court design that's under review for site permitting. So we're very excited and we're hoping it's going to be a positive impact for our downtown redevelopment.
I want to touch on what you say, Jacqueline, and this is tied to the earlier conversation that we had about financials, right? And about the length of time that a developer has to go in, and you got to go through the planning board and you got to go through all these things. When you implement form-based code, you cut at least 8 months of that review process for the developer, which you can translate into money. So I think that looking at the financials of that, it's tangible because the developer can go straight into the development administrative process and doesn't have to go through the planning board or any other board. And I think the challenge with some of these boards sometimes is they don't understand the regulation in detail. And so they can object to a project. And then if you take it to the city council, you have the 10 people that don't want it and all the people that need it that are unable to come to those meetings to speak in support of that development.
So before I move to Brett, I just want to, so we have a messaging challenge around what density actually means. So we need to do a better job, it sounds like, of how we explain what density means. And we have communities that density is going to be different than other parts of the community. And so we have to recognize the nuance piece of that. So Brett, I would love to hear what you had to add to this conversation.
Sure. You know, from an outsider's perspective, I think in what's been successful in the communities that I've worked in are really intense community conversations. You've got this conflict between this barrier, this policy barrier, this public perception barrier, and the virtue of being right? You all know that these are the right policies to implement And I think there's this question of who do you make policy for? You're all very small on my screen, but I think it was Frank who said, you know, there are the 10 people that show up to the meeting, and that's who influences policy. I think there's a point at which everybody can contribute to that conversation and that effort of asking that question: who is policy designed to help? Is it designed to continue to help a very small section of vocal folks that are already here, or is there an opportunity to expand that? And we have different problems in other parts of the country. I'm from Boston. We don't have any land left. And so there's, you know, this is always a conversation of how we create additional opportunities. And there are these tranches of folks who are really, whether they're NIMBYs or, you know, there's the bananas out there, build absolutely nothing. That you can have those community conversations. One successful strategy I recently employed was there's a very wealthy community, and they were talking about density, and I said, here's a question about affordable housing for you, or housing affordability. I said, if you bought your house 35 years ago, if you had to buy your house today, could you afford to live in this community? And the amount of people who are on boards and commissions and say, probably not. Okay, that's a good starting. We've made a connection now to understanding how real this is to you. And the same thing we have a lot of 1950s and 1960s post-war communities. There's a huge boom in a lot of communities up here. And you say, well, we're creating the same kind of attainable housing that you benefited from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Why should we stop doing that? What is the real reason to prevent that from happening? And so I think it's connecting those conversations with individuals in the community that say, this isn't just some scary monster that's called density that we're going to plop 1,000 housing units right next door to your bucolic lifestyle. It really does have an impact on your ability to live the quality of life you want to. It's a conflict for me, because I always think, isn't being right isn't that enough? Knowing that this is the right step to take to make good policy and to improve people's lives, isn't that just enough? But no, we have this policy, we have the public process, we have perceptions, we have all of these other things that we have to sort of navigate around. So community conversations are really powerful, and usually they come from nonprofit organizations or community development organizations or community groups, or to start those conversations, because you reach out to a much broader group.
So just to piggyback off of what Brett just said, public perception is huge. And there is a perception by some in at least in Fort Myers, where we have our share. We have enough. Let somebody else. So that's out there, and that's something we have to work to overcome. What is the real need? We talk about low income. We talk about the middle income, the missing middle, workforce. So we really need to define what are the real needs in your community. We have the tax credit developments. We're pretty successful with helping those in the city. We get a lot of those that come in applying for tax credits, and those are great. Those projects that don't get those doesn't get the assistance, the middle income developments. That's what we've been trying to target in Fort Myers, that they don't get those subsidies, but they're still not affordable. So those are the ones we've been trying to kind of hone in on, is that segment. It's a little bit more probably palatable to a lot of people to say, well, that's your workforce, that's your nurses, your doctors, your teachers, that's who we're focusing on when you put it in that kind of perspective. Oh yeah, we want to help them for sure, but they can also be low income as well. So it's kind of defining what the need is in your city. Is it low income? Is it the middle? Most of it's for the city of Fort Myers, that missing middle, which we try to focus on. But your elected officials are challenged because they have groups coming to them that are pulling them in different directions. We have already too much. We don't have enough. We don't have enough of this. We have too much of that. So they're being pulled in all kinds of different directions. And so they need some consistency in the message. They need the real data to help them make their decision, to say, yes, we do really have a need here that we need to address. And I think when most people see that, they get behind that and support it. But when it just kind of appears that there's an agenda or there's something that's not really to the benefit of the city, people won't support that. But when you can really show that there's a need there that we're trying to fill, then I think your political figures, it can help them get behind that and support that better. But it's a challenge for sure.
So I have a comment and then I have a question for the panel. The first comment is, over the past few days, we've been talking a lot about stigma, regardless of the topic that we're addressing. And we all know that stigma often is an opportunity for education, right? And education also happens from proximity. And so my comment is, we're looking at, and so another comment in full transparency, I used to work with the city of Bonita Springs as a planner, and I applaud everything that they did. But one of the challenges that we had, and this is part of the question, is the education of our elected leaders and council people. It takes time to understand this. You need the institutional knowledge of the context of the culture, the city, where we're going, where we've been, to be able to make those appropriate policy decisions that lead to solutions. But my question is, and also another comment in regards to the historical and the cultural and the arts piece that we talked about very much earlier in the week. Within Bonita, we look to our arts community to help us design the elevations and the exhibits to showcase what a new downtown would look like. So it's another way to embrace and cater to that storytelling and the narrative of where we're going. So my question to the panel is, how do we face the education of our elected leaders and our policies within the term constraints that we have created for them? And how does this reduce the potential for education when often these elected leaders are looking to fully represent the community that they are serving without the institutional knowledge, or only looking to the outside experts to help them make that choice, and not valuing the staff who have the institutional knowledge, the education, the life experience of the context of our communities? I know it's a big one, but go for it.
Boy, that's a big one. I want to go back to a couple previous comments. To Steve's point, we need to be equipped with this data to understand where's our workforce actually live, how many of them are in town. We did a housing affordability study for the city of Naples last year. We could guess, right, that a percentage of the workforce was commuting into the city of Naples. Turns out it's over 90% of the workforce commutes into the city of Naples. I'm willing to bet, having done this study now and looked at city and county trends and even the region, probably every city in the region is importing more of its workforce than lives locally. It's just cheaper to live outside of city centers. So, there's a data point for us that we could share with our elected officials. To our colleague from Bonita Springs, one of the interesting things that emerged out of that Naples study was a suggestion to consider measuring density in terms of floor area ratio, right? How much building square feet is sitting on how many square feet of land, as opposed to how many dwelling units are sitting on how many acres of land. Because if we take a large, town center kind of development that has 2,500 square foot luxury condos on it, the number of dwelling units per acre may fit with whatever that context is, but I could take the next block and build the exact same building with 800 square foot workforce units and have 3 times as many units. And it would look the same from the street, right? You drive by it and you wouldn't know anything different, except that it would fail the test of, well, it's too many dwelling units per acre, so we can't have that density, right? So there are other ways, if we think about what our yardstick is, that would probably be pretty helpful. One other thing on the process that I think is useful, I mentioned this in the first session this morning, that Montana has done some pretty aggressive work on housing in this legislative session. One thing I didn't mention this morning, though, that I think is pretty interesting is they have worked really hard to prioritize shifting the public input period to the planning phase at a general level, right? So we want the public input for sure, but we want it when we're laying out, how do we accommodate all the needs that we have within our city, not at the project phase, right? By the time we get to the project phase, this is by right and it's staff approved. It may go through a city commission, but it's not going to public input on a project by project basis because there's where the NIMBYs show up, right? So public input, but public input at the right time.
I think it still goes back to Jennifer's comment though about education, because I've worked in a lot of these environments, and when you're talking abstractly, everyone's with you until the first project comes in the door. And then like, whoa, wait a minute, that's not what we thought we're going to get. So with civic education, I've seen people do land use schools for their elected officials, be it on planning board or city council. We still need to portray a positive vision of development.
Right. And I think to this point in this conversation, so we've heard some examples from Brett out of town. We've heard some examples from Terry from out of this community. We've heard some examples from Tampa Bay, from Bonita, from Fort Myers. My question that I would pose is, we have all of the leaders of our community development departments either here or on Zoom. Is this an opportunity? Is right now the opportunity for us to have a different cross-jurisdictional conversation of how we address things like this? Because Bonita is not going to address our housing problem. The city of Fort Myers is not going to address our housing problem. So is this the opportunity to actually have that multi-jurisdictional, cross-jurisdictional approach, leveraging a disaster to think about what does the future look like for how we do that? And then what does that solution look like? Look, for anybody that's lived in this community long enough knows the challenges that come with permitting and development. Anybody that's been in that environment at all, we know what those are. Those are going to exist. But what are the opportunities to minimize them or eliminate them where possible to actually solve for the problems that are affecting our community?
I guess I'll wade in. I'm going to put on a different hat. Before I started with the city of Sanibel, I worked for a local engineering firm representing private developers and worked on many housing projects, not necessarily affordable housing. Some of them were affordable housing. And the ones that were easy to get approved or easier to get approved because your neighbors were always concerned about new houses going up, density, neighbors, height, all of those things, whether it's affordable or not affordable. The projects that were easier to get approved were ones where we worked with a community and had community support. So to Jennifer's question about how do we educate public officials, the easiest way for a public official to know, do I want to vote for this or do I want to vote against it, is do the neighbors like it? So if you have your community on board, if you have the neighbors on board with your design, it's going to be much easier to get approved. And just in my experience, one particular project, the community wanted new development. It was underserved by commercial. They didn't have a lot of new housing. They really wanted the project. And then the other one, to Mary's point, their concerns were more about design. What is this going to look like? What am I looking at? And so being able to provide them with that information got their support.
It's like an old question about, are politicians leading the crowd, or they see where the crowd's going and they beat them to that spot? So building that, right. Yes, that's right. Building support in the community first maybe opens the door for that political support that might occur.
So I may be the only elected official in the room. Anybody else elected? Okay, so I am elected to the Lee Health Board, but wearing and I can say any other elected official that I know, we are trying to do the right thing. And we do, Jennifer, to your point, we do lean in heavily to our experts. So we have several here for Lee Health to guide what we do as a board. But what I want to talk about is the education piece, because the other hat that I wear, before the Live Local bill came out, I approached Senator Passidomo and I said, I really want to have some time. And so she's like, absolutely. And I was representing Lee County Homeless Coalition. I knew to bring my counterpart in Collier County, a regional approach. Homelessness is a regional problem. We had a 20-minute slot. She gave us an hour. We were prepared. We brought the data. We had a very, started with a high level conversation that she drove into a deeper dialogue. And so there was definitely things she was unaware of. And I like to think hopefully we contributed to what that Live Local, what came out of that. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, but I do know I like every bit of that Live Local bill and support it fully. So there is that opportunity. I cannot stress enough that that's what I see these folks doing is, do you have governmental affairs? I have one of my Lee Health governmental affairs people in the back there. They do an incredible job educating the public. Do your municipalities have inside governmental affairs people? I'm not talking about contracted, homegrown, know your community that can get out there and educate your elected officials. I think that could be some low hanging fruit.
So Therese, just to add to that and discuss further about the Live Local, we have planning people here who have the right to make it really difficult for NIMBYism to occur, depending on what they're directed by their council on how to address it, right? So there's no public input required under the Live Local Act. So not to be rude to the NIMBYs, but candidly, they don't have a say. If you don't want them to have a say, it's partially a function of how you guys address it and how you engage with it. And it is a people conversation. I mean, somehow we end up talking about this being about buildings. It is a people conversation.
That's right.
And so how do we activate around the tools that you guys have been granted with this act to make it activate?
So just kind of back to what John had mentioned, you know, we talk about at the city that obviously it's not just a local problem, it's a regional problem, it's a national problem, obviously. And so I think, you know, individually, we all do our part, we try to do our part. But I think to really be effective, we need to work together in a regional perspective, a county perspective, and come together and have these types of discussions on a more regular basis. And try to share what each of us are doing and best practices maybe, and things that we can collaborate on and work together to do to solve it on a regional level rather than just on a local jurisdictional level, because we're not going to solve the problem. None of us individually are going to solve the problem, but at least working together and having these types of maybe ongoing meetings like this can help us to feel further along in a more efficient way.
One of the things that maybe you should go first, because what I want to say is like, is going to shift. Well, it's a question of maps, right? So we've been looking at data and we just look at, you know, numbers and that sort of thing. We can look at statistics. You can have a developer and you can bring up your own studies, your pro forma, whatever it is that you have to provide. But in the context of the land use planning and all that, it's also a context of quality of life, right? So when people say, I don't want that in my backyard because I don't want a bunch of apartments, and it's because of traffic and it's because of, you know, how am I gonna, whatever the idea is, that through maps, we have the ability to show people something. So what I've seen is that through Lee County Economic Development Office, there is development maps that are out there through GIS. And so we tell people the new developments that are coming. There is no story to tell us how are those developments tied to all the other assets that the community has around. And so through GIS, we have the ability not only to analyze the data and show where things maybe need to go, but also an opportunity to do some storytelling. And I had asked Jason to come and maybe you can share a little bit of how that can look like, because I think that's a easy opportunity that it can be on a website, just like we're showing people that new developments are coming in. So just.
I guess you're talking about like a story map. Because I'm not.
Yeah, doing like looking
So-
at data and looking at story
Yeah.
maps.
So one of the ways that you can do that to kind of tell what's happening or what the development is bringing to the table is there's things such called story maps. And then you can build a story map where it's first thing is, it's like it would show, I guess, sorry, in my head, I'm trying to picture this, but you'd have all your developments that are coming into the county or wherever, your municipality. And then you click on it and then it will start, you can start scrolling through and it can give whatever information, whatever story you want to tell, how many jobs it's bringing, or, how many, if it's, I guess, mixed use development, or basically everything you want to tell the public or your officials or everything to educate them, to give them a better idea of what it's really bringing to the table. It's not just 2,500 single family units and with 500 multifamily and things like that. You can have, you can put anything in there from videos to photos to links to probably other developments like that around the country to show them what exactly this is.
I think
So-
Dan's comment earlier about it's about people. When developers put out brochures for their new development, they don't necessarily talk about, it's $200 a square foot. It's, they're showing people in their lifestyle and the couple sitting by the fireplace and blue skies. They're telling a story about the quality of life of living in that community. And do we as public, or do you as public agencies put forth that same kind of ideas about the quality of life that you're pushing forward? Yes, ma'am.
But I don't want to be, I guess, the anti-person in the room here, but I think what you're saying is great. But I think if you get, you're talking practically speaking, you can tell the story, you can tell the story, you can tell the story. But until the residents around there see some kind of solution to the traffic problem or some kind of solution to the water pressure problem, they are still going to be very concerned. I mean, I'm telling a story Tuesday night. I'm telling the story. I've got the Dover coal plant. That was the Lee Health property. It's beautiful. It's a mixed use. It's exactly what the village wants to see. But I've got neighbors that are going to say the traffic is level service F. What are you doing to fix it? Nothing. Why are you doing this? So storytelling sounds great, but I think when you get right down and dirty, it's a little bit tricky.
Gary, you had a comment.
Yeah, I think this is consistent with what we just said, but and it's repetitive, but I want to say it. It's fascinating. This session is so focused on communication. Not exactly what I was expecting, but that it's, I think, on the right direction. I'm going to pick on John. You said leveraging the hurricane to get this done. I do think we have to be very careful in the words we choose, because you're in one respect, you're right. In another respect, someone can twist that to say they always wanted this before. Now they're using the hurricane to get something. And that's really not exactly, that's not what we're doing. I wouldn't want to be a part of that. What we're doing is we're recognizing that we have a responsibility to build back. And we're going to build it back in a responsible way. So we're not using it. We have to build back, but we want to build it back in a way that's better for our community and that's going to benefit the community. It's the same thing you meant, but the words are harder to twist by those who are going to be against us.
Right. Yeah, it's leveraging the resources.
Exactly.
Because
we have to do this.
Correct.
It's going to get built
Correct.
back. It can either get built back in a way that doesn't solve any problems, or it can get built back in a way that really solves problems. And that's what we're here to do. So that was one thing. And then the second part had to do, I guess, with some of what you were saying with trying to think of how to put it to make it clear. The way people get on your side is they see how it benefits them.
Right.
Right. Human beings tend to look out for themselves first and their family first. And so when I tell the story about why this is important to me, I talk about my kids, because that's important to me. And my kids have gone through a heck of a time mostly in Orlando and West Palm Beach. But if we can make the story about the people, and I love the story about, because you're absolutely right, whoever said about if you go to dinner and you can't find wait staff, it's a workforce problem. The workforce problem is probably tied to the housing problem, et cetera. Same with if you can't get a dentist appointment, or if you can't get an appointment to get an MRI. It's probably a workforce problem that was exacerbated by a housing problem. And we've hired 2 solid HVAC technicians in the last 4 months that were coming and they didn't because they couldn't find a place to live. That's a real story. So if we can make it about their experience, then I think we got a chance to get the NIMBYism to a minimum.
Before you jump in, Frank, I know we have development represented on, I mean, from a land perspective or from a development perspective, you know, there's also messaging and communications and stories that need to be understood a little bit more fully.
I mean, that's probably some of the hardest part. I mean, there's no cross collaboration between any of the municipalities when you're doing mapping and trying to showcase sites. So, you know, when a landowner wants to sell their parcel, we have to convince the developer there's an opportunity and kind of showcase the opportunity via all the statistics that are out there and what's available. So I think one of the more difficult things is that Lee County's EDO does have that mapping that shows all the development activity, but there's not one for Bonita, there's not one for Estero, or that's unified. So you have to keep switching back and forth. So I think just showing that unified would be very, very helpful, especially to help developers get activated on some of these sites.
To that point, is there interoperability between the mapping tool that EDO has and the asset mapping through HVS? Or no? Is it the
It's
same?
GIS.
It's just GIS. So is there a way to showcase the impact, right? So we have the EDO of what could be or what's coming. We have asset mapping there was a very robust dialogue about asset mapping a few days ago or yesterday. And if we were to overlay that, leveraging the friction points, the pressure points to create what could be in a visual manner, it would seem to be that you would be able to carve out Bonita, carve out and create almost like a buffet of options where the individuals in the communities could see themselves in solving their individual problems. So is story mapping a part of that?
It could be. I mean, you can make it whatever you want. And you can, like how you said, you'd like to see them all together. Everything could be put together and then you press a button and it filters stuff out just with the touch of a button. I mean, it's just getting people to say they want to do that.
So, and maybe like geolocation data, like showing those cell phones moving, like at 8 a.m. Here they all come from these communities to these communities. That's very simply done. I mean, there's all kinds of services out there you can buy that on. And, I think that tells a really powerful story about how far people are commuting to work and the challenges faced there.
Oh, good.
To Gary's point a minute ago, about getting rebuilt and rebuilding with equity. One of the projects we're working on right now, in partnership with DataKind, which is a global NGO that works on applying data science to social challenges, funded with a Rockefeller grant, is to look at not just how many housing units did we lose with the storm, but what was the economic value of those housing units, who was living in them, how many of them were homesteaded, because we have really good counts of what units we lost. We don't have really great data on, was there a $180,000 house that sustained major damage, and 5 days after the storm, knock, knock, investor with a checkbook from Miami to say, I'll buy your house unless you want to wait for your FEMA check for a year. But what's coming back when houses like that are replaced is not another $180,000 house that a teacher could afford. It's a $380,000 house that somebody moving here from New Jersey is going to buy. So we're very concerned about how to understand the data in a way that helps us rebuild in the most resilient way. To the point of community input earlier, I'm often think about Henry Ford's words, right? If I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. So sometimes we have to kind of lead the conversation. That goes back to Jennifer's earlier point about education. And Dan, to your point, Live Local doesn't require community input. True, Live Local actually doesn't allow community input. It's a requirement that you have to be, like, if you meet all the requirements, then you have to be approved. I met with the state senator to clarify that, and she said, please, when you're out meeting with folks, help them understand this is a non-negotiable point from the state legislature's point of view. We'll stand on the side of the development community to get this stuff built. We're trying to get the process out of the way of getting built what we know needs to get built for our workforce.
Yes, it take me a minute. I'm a country boy, so I have to try to listen and put things together in my head. Basically, what I'm hearing is that in most of these cases, we have to go out in these communities and educate folks on what we're doing. And what I learned in doing this, and also being a minister, when I preach to 10 people or 200, I have to speak in a way that the least of those can understand what I'm saying, even though they may be understanding part of it. But I have to understand, I got people out there that has no clue of what I'm talking about, so I have to speak to them more so than the ones that's high level. And I'm gonna share this with all you folks. I'm trying to insult anybody, but all of you are professionals in your area, and every area you're in has its own language. So you're talking to people who have no clue half the times when you got GMS. What's that? They don't know what that is, a GMI or GMS, whichever that mapping thing you're talking about. They have no clue what that is. So you're telling and explaining things. You're talking about density. We went over in the Dunbar community about 15 years ago, and we were trying to do a rezoning effort over there because when they widened 82, they cut off all the frontage of the land on the south side of that road. So we had to go do silhouettes and all this stuff in the community about redeveloping and what we need to make this zone change to get the people with us. Only thing that old lady realized, we said mixed use development. And we said commercial. All she can think about was the fact that we finna put this big building right next to her little old house and gonna drown her out and gonna push all these people in these homes that's been here for 100 years out of the community. There's no way to explain that to them. No, that's not what we're doing, because they don't want to hear it. That's what they think because of what we said. That's how they interpret what we said, and that's how they walk it. One of the reasons last week in the Economic Development Committee, we had a presentation by these 3D people. What, Steve, you remember the name of them? Most of you probably know them.
Yeah, Gary Hoyt.
Yes. And about 15 years ago, Dan Everloff and I and Rachel Bush was in Orlando where we first met those folks. And Rachel used them to do a presentation for North Fort Myers redevelopment for the county's incentive program to do facade money. They put $2 million up in the fund, and they used that program to show the people the impact of what they would look like after they did that. They can do it now in real time. Tampa, Sarasota, all these cities are using this concept. I don't know why we're not. Because you can put that video on the screen. You can put any building you decide in the middle of downtown Fort Myers, and you can see the impact of that in real time. Traffic, sun going up or down, what's next to it, what's next to that. You can show people that they can see what you're trying to get done. They can see what you're saying and what you mean by mixed use. They can obviously see that. And that to me should be, right now with this program, should be something we should all be looking at. Say, how can we incorporate that here? Because this will give you a way of exactly seeing what impact of development, how it's going to impact the community, how it relates to the old lady with the little house and the mixed use career. She can actually see this working. She said, oh, now I see. And I think that's a huge, may cost a few bucks, but I think that's well worth the investment. I'm tired of working with you city folk and county folk with no vision. This will give you an opportunity to produce that. You can make it tangible, hands-on, and all that good stuff. So I just want to throw that out there so they can understand that kind of language without you guys using your acronyms and all that stuff that nobody knows but you in your arena. Yeah, it goes, well, I'm being
No,
funny.
no, that's real.
But I'm being real too. This is what we need to understand. That's why a lot of folks have problems understanding and following us when we make these presentations in these public arenas, but they really don't understand half of what we're talking about.
The other thing that we're dealing with a lot of times when we're advocating in these housing issues and developments is misinformation, especially on Facebook. Like there is an ordinance the county is going to look at next week that's going to change the height requirements for South Seas. And everyone in this whole county thinks it's changing the height requirements for the entire county. It's not. It's changing it for one little area on Captiva Island. And people just don't understand the process. They don't understand what's in the ordinances. And misinformation on Facebook is just destroy. Like for someone who advocates in front of local government, I'm advocating. It doesn't matter what I say or what staff says. They just don't believe you.
I like using this phrase and I didn't come up with it. The past is always present. When you're working in public sector, when you walk in the door, there's someone who remembers 10 years ago how you didn't, the zoning happened and you didn't listen to them. And so the fact that you're new staff or you're the new elected official, all that history of what's happened in the community is right there with you. And sometimes that's a difficult thing to deal with.
Lee, I just want to make sure that we capture what you said, because I think there's some, and it sort of came from the development side of there's this need for this universal language. Like that's probably common. Like there's the technical side of how we get there. Like when you go to the doctor, they don't tell you like all the pieces and parts of your entire working body. If they have to do surgery, they tell you they're going to fix your knee, right? And so it's just, how do we build a common language across jurisdictions? So some sort of shared language opportunity. Similarly to the tool side, like what are the shared tools we can be using, whether it's things like GIS or this, digital imaging sort of way of doing, like what are these sort of common tools that we could leverage to also help start to be part of that story. And I do know we do have one branch member that has a comment in the chat.
So this is Maya Roberts, branch member. There are also funding opportunities to utilize land that have environmental remediation needs that can be taken into account by local governments using resilience and upcoming grant funding, because those have less competition for upscale development. And then also, I guess, from Kara, panelist, if doing a housing needs assessment, it may be helpful to consider the additional squeeze of flood hazards and future flooding. And she provides a
brownfield development, in other words. I'm sorry, John.
No, I was going to say Brett has his hand up
as
well on Zoom as a panelist.
I just wanted to say that part of that is not just a conversation, but it's empowerment. I think it's empowering communities and empowering all of the people we want to be participants in that conversation to actually have a voice in decision making. And you see that all the time, right? You show up and people are disengaged because they feel like they've been mistreated in the past, or they feel like you didn't do what you said you were going to do in the past. And it's not just about talking to them. And oftentimes we see this all the time where you only come into the community when you need something from me and then we never hear from you again. It's about actually genuinely engaging with those people and those communities and finding ways to elevate that level of empowerment to the place where those 10 people that show up to the city council meeting every week or every month they have that power. I think that's how you really create communities that are engaged and willing to learn and participate. And really they're bespoke conversations, right? There are conversations with community members that are different than conversations with politicians. And the last thing I'll say on that is the conversation that was talking about, how do you educate the decision makers or the politicians? Part of that has to be consequent. There have to be actual consequences to inaction or action that produces subpar public policy. Otherwise, there's really no incentive to make that leap and educate yourself and really commit to that effort. And so, there's a lot of ways you can do that, but I think you all speak the language of housing, and I think you understand that when you think about and you talk about housing as a human right, it sounds different than housing is just a big building where it's going to block light or it's going to create traffic or it's going to do some other thing. So I think really I've forgotten who said it, but connecting that back to these conversations are about people, not physical structures.
Since we circled back to the elected officials through that comment, which I appreciate, I think one of the things that we have to remember as staff and in general, and one of the things I try to, people will say beat into elected officials' heads, is I start every conversation about affordable housing with the same exact PowerPoint slide. And it says, you have an obligation under chapter 360 of the Florida statute to provide for the affordable housing needs of your current and your future residents. How are you going to do that? So every time you just say, you have an obligation, you have to do this. How are you going to do it? I'm going to tell you how we're going to do that. So, but they will tell you, they see that slide every single time. And our Citizens Academy sees it every single time I do an affordable housing presentation. And it's always really well received. Our Chamber of Commerce leadership, same slide is in there, because as long as they know, you have an obligation to the public,
Right.
you have an obligation under state law.
Right.
What are you going to do?
There's a comment that this young lady made a few minutes ago, and I want to bring it back to this issue about public policy and how we operate. And it gets to the sort of quality of life issue, because all these are so connected. And it's about expectations. When a new development comes in, one of the typical responses is it's going to bring more traffic. So the level of service on this roadway is going to drop from C to D. Why is there an expectation that it should always be at C? So we've created an expectation in our community. Like, I go in a parking lot, my expectation is I'm going to find a parking space. Well, if it's a successful business, maybe not. So should we build more parking? Should we widen more streets? And then to this gentleman's point, I want him to sort of respond to, how do we pay for this stuff? I mean, public policy, we're talking about, the development side of it. There needs to be roadways. There needs to be water and sewer and the infrastructure necessary to support development. What's our response to that? What's the public policy? Should, their development fees, but let's be honest, most of the time, if it's a regional sewer system, one guy developing, or even a sidewalk, where sidewalks don't exist, then you have a mismatch pattern of one guy builds the sidewalk, the property owners on either side, they're not redeveloping. So now you got 50 feet of sidewalk. So my question to you is, relative to the public policy component, what land use policies do we have, or should we have, that deal with the issue of development and development providing the foundation of infrastructure, or rather providing the foundation of infrastructure for housing development to occur? What's the public policy issue there?
Well, we have our comprehensive plans, and we have our future land use elements, and we have our policies, and we have our level of services. And every time we go to a community meeting or a council district meeting, and when we cite these policies, because the questions get asked to us, well, why are you allowing this development to take place? It's adding more traffic to the roads. And we give a good technical answer, kind of getting back to Lee's point, and cite a policy and cite a level of service, and the road's not failing, and blah, 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 blah. And we do that, and we can answer that question in a technical manner and be accurate with that question. So it's definitely a challenge, but a lot of the people that are complaining moved here from somewhere else. And we don't point that out, but I'd love to, but we don't. And so we have thousands and thousands of people that have moved here, and they've added to the demand on the infrastructure. And now they want us to stop and not let anybody else come in, because, now the roads are full. Well, why are the roads full? So it's a debate we have. We try to, there's not really an answer that can satisfy the public fully, to say, okay, I understand now, because they have a mindset that, there's too much development taking place. We need to, and really, no matter what policy you cite or answer you give them, it's not really going to satisfy some people.
So how do we address the expectation issue that I should be able to drive out of my driveway and the road, there shouldn't be anybody else on the road. I should be able to go to the grocery store, should be parking spots right in front of right in front of it. I should be able to have sunlight to my house or the view to the ocean. Apply it to any amenity that brought you to this community, knowing that change, any kind of change, impacts that, as you said. How do we deal with that on a public policy?
It requires a transformational shift in how we think about the problems. So as we saw in our transportation workshop, it's not a matter of more cars or faster ability to get from point A to point B. It's transforming how we think about moving people. It's leveraging the tools that exist. I'd like to hear more about, sustainability, walkability, complete streets, yes. Mixed use. Because just like transportation, housing, it's a people issue.
I have a question for each of you at the cities. Accessory dwelling units. Can you tell me if your city has them? And if they don't have them, can you tell me the barriers of why you don't have them?
We do have accessory dwellings that were kind of grandfathered in from years ago, and so we don't allow any new accessory dwellings. We did bring an ordinance forward to city council a couple of years ago to enact a new accessory dwelling unit ordinance. They turned it down. There was concerns with, neighborhood compatibility and things like that. And so, we brought it forward with the intent of, well, this is another way to kind of address that affordability issue. And, it's not gonna solve the problem, but it does add a piece to it. But I think there was a bigger concern of the what would it do to your neighborhood, allowing these accessory dwelling units in a nice single family neighborhood. So I'd love to bring it back another time, but yeah, we tried to do that previously and it was turned down.
In Estero, we do allow accessory dwelling units. We have the same ordinance as the county, basically. But we have a lot of gated subdivisions, planned developments, and so a lot of them, of course, don't allow it. But we do encourage it where we can.
And to be clear, as we work against vernacular and jargon, I had to ask. Accessory dwelling unit is the mother-in-law suite or the pool house or the cabana house. Garage apartment. Thank you.
So the city of Sanibel does not allow accessory dwelling units. One of the, and I'll just throw this out here as another barrier against affordable housing, is balancing some of the issues that we have. Florida Building Code, city of Sanibel is entirely within flood hazard areas. It's in a coastal high hazard area. The cost of building a structure is much higher there than in inland Lee County. And the other thing, when the city of Sanibel incorporated almost 50 years ago, they were looking at how Fort Myers Beach was developing and saying, hey, we don't want all those high rises. We want to protect our beaches and our nature. 60% of the island is in conservation. And so how do you balance those needs for, yes, we want to accommodate people who come here and visit and love the island and want to move here versus protecting what brought them there in the first place. And I think that is a big struggle that we have regionally. There's a reason we moved here, for our beautiful beaches, our wonderful waterways. How do we protect that and allow development? And
My hope on Sanibel would only be give proximity to the jobs. The reality is to own real estate there it's expensive, and it should be, because you can't insure it and you can't protect it because it can't be protected. So we shouldn't be putting individuals below 160% income into an area that their home gets knocked down and they can't insure it, right? Like, that's just reckless engagement. But you can allow for proximity to jobs. So engaging your commercial zoning in place could allow for less traffic and still provide housing for jobs. And that's back to my integrated zoning that allows for different uses would be the hope in all those scenarios. Just add the ancillary housing to the commercial zoning and only in the commercial zoning and nowhere else.
And the other thing I just want to say for the record, the city of Sanibel, the city council, planning commission, they are all very supportive of affordable housing and want to bring workforce housing to the island. I mean, back in the day, you could afford to live there and be a normal, everyday, average earner and live on Sanibel.
So I think that I mentioned this in the previous workshop, but the city of Cape Coral does not allow accessory dwelling units. We also made an attempt in 2019 to allow for accessory dwelling units. And that and a number of other, what the city council at that time deemed community values issues were removed from the land development code at that point. I believe now, I think we're starting to see some conversations about bringing some of those community value issues back forward, as they call them. So every year when our Affordable Housing Advisory Committee meets, we talk about these. And every year we have a very vibrant discussion about them, but a lot of the time we had this exact same conversation that the city of Fort Myers had about the concerns.
I understand those concerns, but with Lee County having so much pre-platted land mass, I mean, we're unlike a lot of other counties in the state where we have, 100, almost 100 square miles in Cape Coral, almost 100 square miles in Lehigh of pre-platted land masses, single family. That's why the addition of the ADUs would complement all this platted.
And the 120 square miles and then doubling the density really scares people.
Yeah.
I can tell you that.
Well, and those
Hold on, hold on, give other folks, I'm sorry, Gary, go ahead.
I did want to ask a question specifically about Sanibel. I was told by an advocate for housing on Sanibel that part of your city charter requires Sanibel to have a certain level of investment in affordable, or I'm not sure what the term was, but in workforce housing. Do you know what that is? And is there an opportunity there? Because I'm also told the city council has not made good on that requirement.
We do have, as I mentioned before, the below market rate housing program, which has been in existence almost as long as the city. So it's been an issue that the city has been concerned with since its inception.
But does it actually require, or is it just encourage it? I was
So-
told it's required, and that again, and I don't know if that, again, with misinformation, maybe I was given misinformation. That's what I'm trying to vet out.
So city council does have an obligation to help fund, or not fund, but work with a community housing partner to provide affordable housing. We have about 80 units right now that are in that program. But again, as I mentioned before, we also have very strict limitations on density. There is an exception for and only for below market rate housing to increase density. Otherwise, it has to go to a charter amendment, which goes to the voters in a voter referendum. So, yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about this, and I think Dan might have mentioned this a second ago. How has Hurricane Ian, or how do you anticipate it will impact land use policy? Because, to your comment, Sanibel's in, a high risk hazard zone. As we've discovered, there are other areas that may not have been identified prior to the hurricane, who now have been identified as being in high risk zones. So how do you anticipate your land use policies being impacted by this disaster?
So I'll speak to that real quick without wearing a government hat any longer.
Sure.
Watching some of the discussions that have happened pre and post Ian, there was a resistance regionally to work collectively. I'll say that. After Ian, there was a support from some of our elected officials that yes, we must work together to build back better. I will also say that a lot of the work that has been done regionally through different envelopes like the Regional Planning Council no longer is supported. And when I look at that from a social capacity, a community development perspective, it concerns me. And so I think when we are looking at how we can build back better, how we can somewhat start the conversations back, some of the things that we had in the past need to be resurrected in order to have that more regional conversation.
I want to piggyback to what Jen said back in maybe 2010, 2012, the Department of Community Affairs was killed by the governor at the time. When that happened, local governments didn't have to report their comprehensive plans any longer to the state. So everybody just kind of did whatever. And as a local government, is your choice to be part of the Regional Planning Council. And so I believe the Regional Planning Council in our area only has like 2 municipal entities that are part of it. So when we do that and we choose as a government entity not to support a Regional Planning Council that can help us put these efforts together, we're doing a disservice. We have someone with the Tampa Regional Planning Council area, and maybe she can speak to that a little bit because it is a need that we have. The other thing that I wanted to say is kind of going back to what Stephanie brought up about moving people, right? It's like the transportation piece that keeps coming back and forth. And it is a question to the panel, like how many of our municipal entities that are being represented here have a vision for transportation that supports multi-use transportation, that has a vision of how we creating a network that is going to support future developments. Because if we have this as a vision and it's put somewhere, this is something that we can show people how we alleviate traffic and how many of the entities have an updated parking study that supports, like how we can think about creatively about providing parking that is concentrated in a particular area, so you lower the cost of development. So all of these are kind of part of the land development code, and those are solutions that need to be actively implemented, so.
I can talk to the city of Cape Coral, kind of related to the transportation question. As I was told recently, if you add up all the roads in Cape Coral, it can go from Cape Coral to Chicago. So we have a lot of roads. And so we are just starting off and just recently kicked off our first multimodal study. And it's really, we're going to start having community workshops later this month on that. So I think as a result of that, you're going to kind of see a shift in some of our focus. We're very roadway heavy. We're only served, a quarter of our city is served by Lee-Tran. And we know the constraints associated with the paratransit. So I think you're going to see our programs become a little more robust as time goes on. We're actually very excited about this multimodal study and we have big hopes for it.
I think one of the things that concerns me the most about how land use, so far at least, doesn't seem to be changing after the storm is every house I see that took on 4 or 5 feet of water that's rebuilding exactly where it was. I go, well, that's my insurance bill going up, right? Because we're letting you rebuild in a place that we know at some point in the next 20 years is probably going to flood again. I think here we are sitting right on a resilient new task force. Like, can we have that conversation?
No.
Well, insurance is certainly going to impact your land use policies. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, and I was going to say exactly what I think the point you're trying to make, which is one, it's a big deal. And a lot of people are building back, not understanding what's probably going to happen to them in a couple of years, and their property is going to become less and less affordable for them. And people just either don't want to accept that or they can't figure it out. But I don't know that we need to address it. I don't know that it's certainly not a county issue, but we still need to address it if we can, or at least come up with a way to educate people, because it's going to explode, I think, for some people.
I think it's going to affect affordability of housing.
That's my point.
And I'll speak for myself with my $12,000 a year insurance bill now. That before Ian, what happens next? How do I retire with that hanging over my head that this is doubling every 2 years? This is a real problem. I mean, we have found our community was underinsured for sure. We're going to talk about people not being able to afford insurance at all.
Can I speak about the land use issue? As a planner, I sit back and I think, okay, when I look at this for land use decisions and you look at where we're impacted and people come in to get the permits to build back and you go, you really shouldn't be building back. We should be buying some of these floodplain areas and not letting people build back. Then you get the poor people coming into your office. They're 80 something years old. They've had the property for 40 years. They're crying, so you've got that human element of the people whose life savings and they're just trying to find a place to live. So you know, you're torn between the land use policy and then the human aspects. And then when you think about, you know, like elected officials with the people crying in their offices, I mean, how do you balance that? It's heartbreaking.
Mary, that's the problem. That the reason I say no isn't just to be a jerk, which is my natural state. It's more a function of the ones that can't are the ones that are still stuck doing it, right? So it's, if you're well insured and you have sufficient funds to fix up your house and execute, fine. But examples are Harlem Heights, where 80+% are homeowners and have multiple generations, and we allowed building to occur, and there is absolutely no way that they have another option. And even if you tell them, I promise you, your home will be buried in water at some point over the next 100 years, their response is, well, so I can get $110,000 for my nothing now that I can't, who's going to pay them that even? And then I can go where? Where? Like, there's no other alternatives unless we provide some mechanism for that. So I don't know how to navigate those things other than not allowing back to build back and then have a buy program in place.
But that is such an interesting comment you just made, because knowing that you've got these populations that are vulnerable and at risk, what is the plan to try and keep them in the community to areas or parcels where there's adequate infrastructure to support it and land use policies that accept them, and a sharing of property tax revenues? So you're not at a loss because people have moved out of your community, which really pushes this issue of regional planning and cooperation, it seems to me.
So thank you for that. That was a great transition to a last question and close out, because, you know, Tessa's not here today, but she would want us to make sure we end on time. So I want to be respectful of all of your time. But I think as we close this out, so we heard a few things. There's this idea of some common language. There's this opportunity, didn't get a whole lot of bites, but there's opportunity that you mentioned, Terry, around this. How do we start looking at, you know, have all of these different comprehensive plans, you have all of these different sort of things that exist in the county. What are those opportunities to maybe start looking at, like, how do we start working on those at a actual comprehensive plan perspective for the whole county and then ultimately the region? There's this idea of some level of education and awareness and leveraging tools and resources that maybe one municipality is using that other municipalities could use, whether that's code types, whether that's digital tools to visualize what we're trying to build in a neighborhood or at a community. Like, there's all of these sort of little like things that are already working in our community that we could leverage across the broader. There's this whole conversation around ADUs. We've been talking about ADUs, I don't know, a decade at least. We've been talking about accessory dwelling units. And so this idea of, like, how do we actually think about what does an accessory dwelling unit look like? How does that affect Cape Coral that has roads from here to Chicago from a density perspective? What does that do to our community? So there's all of these things. So I guess the last question that I would pose, and I'm only posing it to those that work for the public sector, and Brandon, I want you to weigh in on this too, virtually, is what do we think as a result of Ian, our individual municipalities, the county, whatever it might be, is willing to put on the table as it relates to an initiative around land use policy, so we can start to think about how we solve for housing in Lee County? Steve, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, John. Well, that's a huge task for sure. You know, we all have our jurisdictions we work in, and that's what we focus on primarily. And we have our own elected officials we have to answer to, and they have to answer to the public in their communities. So that's where we start, is at that point there. And so kind of what I said before, I think the more we can communicate together with each other and have those conversations with each other, we're not going to agree on everything. And we don't have to, I don't think, because if we think we're going to, then it's not going to work. But I think the more we can talk together and find some shared and common interests, goals, and try to move those forward in a realistic way, I think that's kind of where we have to start. I think there's always going to be things that, as a city of Fort Myers, we're going to do that Estero's not going to do, and vice versa. And we just have to recognize that, you know, we have our own kind of different values, cultures, and we recognize that, but I think there's some shared values, shared things in our cultures that we can identify and use those and highlight those and move forward with those. But it's a very long process, but I think it's one we have to undertake, if we really want to kind of be successful in tackling these problems.
Mary?
What Steve said.
So there is an interest that we have our own individual sort of municipal or county, unincorporated county and community sort of identities, but there is an interest of how are some of these bigger that impact every community, policy changes or land use changes or conversations that we can have that there would be a potential to have a unified conversation.
And actually, you probably need to even look beyond, because somebody brought up, I think it was Jen maybe, but Naples, or maybe
Yep.
it was you, people commuting from Naples. So I mean, it's an even bigger issue, but you might have to tackle small bites.
Thank you, Paul.
So I would say what's changed for the city since Hurricane Ian, well, lots of things have changed. But realizing, as I said before, this has been a priority for the city since its inception, but realizing now, we have 80 workforce housing units on the city of Sanibel. That's a drop in the bucket. That doesn't really address the issue for the city. So it does really need to be looked at regionally. How can we have this conversation, continue this conversation into the future about how to address this regionally? And then my last, just as an affordable housing, I work for the city of Sanibel. I live in the village of Estero.
So you're aware. So you want to flip you want to live on Sanibel and work in Estero, or you guys just want to trade jobs? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Cape Coral.
I'm going to agree with the rest of the panelists. I think there is definitely an opportunity, actually, not only in our future land use and our land use elements of our comp plans, but also for us to really take a hard look at our housing elements of our comp plans. I know a lot of us haven't really taken a strong look at our housing elements probably since 1989 when they became required. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to just have mutual goals within the housing element that we can work towards.
Great, thank you. And before we get to Brandon, Jacqueline, are you still online and would like to share from Benita's perspective?
I agree with Steve's first points. It's every community is different. We have our own community vision plans, and the council sets the policy. So we are definitely there to provide them the best information and recommendations available, but it's the council that sets the policy. And I guess that's really what I would add at this time.
Thank you. Brandon?
I guess first, since I haven't said much during this, I would like to say that I've agreed with generally everything I've heard today about what the issues are facing, attainable housing. But as far as coordination and working together, as Jackie and Steve had said, we work and we support our policymakers. We don't set the policy. But I see a lot of opportunities here just listening to the conversations had and listening to the different strategies that people have developed to help fill out our communities, that I do think a continued conversation at this level I would benefit from, just knowing, how do we look at density equivalence? That's not something we really do in Lee County, but it could be a helpful tool for us. So I would like to see continued collaboration maybe at this level, just to share strategies.
Great, thank you. And before I turn it over to public comment, any other last burning thoughts from the panel or from the branch members? Do we have any other comments or chat in the chat? Nope.
Chime in one thing quickly. When we talk about the cost of infrastructure and new development, I think it's worth keeping in mind that the cheapest development we can do is redevelopment, where we've already got sewage and we've already got roads and we already have electrical and every time somebody says to me, well, there's just no land left here, I go, may I invite you to walk outside with me and look at the 2 acres of parking that we are sitting in the middle of, and just imagine what those 2 acres might turn into if we drop them into Sanibel right now, where 2 acres of parking might turn into something a little more economically valuable. So we got to get a little clever about what we can do with what we've already got, right? One-story buildings and parking lots. We could densify on top of existing infrastructure in a way that would reduce a lot of costs.
Thank you, Frank. Any more comments from the branch members? We have one in the chat.
Sandy Stillwell, who is the lead of the Planning Capacity Branch. This workshop has been very helpful to and in learning about the various cities and how we need to coordinate and work together. It is a good starting point. Now we need to come up with a clear plan.
Great. Thanks, Sandy. All right, before I close out the conversation of the branch and the panelists and open up public comment, this is available, this QR code, or if you just go to resiliently.com, this is where you can put in initiatives. I heard lots of different things of opportunities here. We've captured all of that as best as we could. But if there are initiatives or ideas that either panelists that are joining us virtually or folks have throughout the community want to share, please put them in there. So what are the ideas of how we make Lee County more resilient? And then what are those specifically related to this workshop topic conversation? What are those ways that we can really start to change land use policy or adjust land use policy, or what land use policy do we already have that we really need to capitalize on? So those are some of the things that we would want to hopefully get from this workshop there. Terry, do you have any comments before I close it?
No, I think, well, I guess I do then. I think Frank's comment is a good one. There's lots of investment in what we already have, you know, so let's reuse what we already have. The idea about recycling and adaptation, et cetera, is important because we can't keep building new.
Great. Thanks, Terry. And thanks to the panel and to the branch. I'm going to open it up to public comment. If there's anybody from the public that has a comment, please state your name and your organization. And sorry, Tessa, we're not going to get done.
I'm sorry. I don't want to be the person standing in between lunch, but my name is Jessica Turner. I am the coordinator for the Regional Housing Coalition, and the backbone organizations for that are Collaboratory and Bright Community Trust. And I am first off, I learned so much today. Thank you guys for your thoughtful questions and the discussion. And just on Steve's point, and then it seemed to be everybody's point at the end, we do need to have a more unified conversation about how we're going to be planning and moving forward with affordable housing in our area. There are members that are on the branches that are partners on the coalition. And I just wanted to introduce myself so you could see my face. And I wanted to make sure that maybe I could meet with some of the panelists in the future, because we would love to have your expertise on the coalition moving forward as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
Hi, my name is Marcia Ellis, and I apologize for the late entry. Trust me, I've wanted to be here so much. I've literally spent the past couple of weeks in deep dive research about the multi-residential market here locally, how that works with global investment, the rampant profiteering of these multi-residential units at the expense of our residents who are paying in excess 30–50% of their median income, and really trying to examine also the insurance implications in that multi-res and commercial market as we're bearing the burden as single residential holders, and trying to grasp this picture. Very concerned about the underprivileged and underrepresented populations in this community having future access, and super suspicious about the poster that was brought forth to the public, and with those options of deregulation, of changing zoning, smoothing the way for developers, and providing incentives in a market that is already yielding profits. In the apartment building that sold next to me with an appreciation of 1,335% over an 18 months. So this is global investment opportunity in this market, and one of the things I'm most excited about are some emerging models, the community ownership, emerging models and roles of philanthropy, which is being organized by the indigenous communities in this country to try to get more community ownership, property ownership, and have community engagement through some novel models. That I found that on the EPA site for affordable housing. And I think that that's part of this picture when we talk about incentivizing. I was at a zoning hearing that was approving a rehearing on the Greenwell 31 project that has multi-housing in the high coastal hazard area. All right, so I had to make a decision on how to use my time. I think that as a housing branch, that examining the appropriateness of multi-residential and a high hazard, a coastal hazard area, that is very, very much important. So we already have enough people at risk in this community without putting more there. And I look very much forward to hopefully, I mean, maybe there's going to be video, PowerPoint, et cetera, and trying to get caught up and find that point where we can bring things together. Because I don't think it's appropriate to ask community members what's more important to your family: deregulation, changing the density and zoning plan, or more incentivizing for profiteering. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
Yeah, it seemed like one of the common topics. Oh, sorry, Kyle Doyon, developer. I live in Cape Coral. I'm originally from Michigan, and most of my development's been up there, and I sat on DDA boards and stuff up there, Downtown Development Authority. It seemed like the NIMBY was one of the big things that really was across the board here. You know, whether you guys are trying to change your, land use policies or even just utilize the land you currently have, you fight the NIMBY, and we fought that up there. The perception that everyone gets to put out there by coming and doing that and having the loudest screaming voice, being the keyboard jockeys, it takes 10 times saying something positive before one of those negatives gets pulled back. And one of the things that we started doing in the community up there was putting out the positive information campaigns, where every time you could put something on a billboard or on a bandit sign or hanging on a post somewhere, it was welcome to the community. Hey, we're redeveloping for you. We're glad you're coming here. Live closer. Live close to where you work, whatever it is. Figure out those little messages that you want to put out and put them everywhere.
Thank you. And I just want to I do want to clarify that all of these have been recorded, and so they will be available on the Resiliently website for anybody that may have missed a workshop and would like to watch it. All right. Any other comments in the chat? Great. So thank you all. Thank you to the panelists. We really appreciate all of you taking your time today. To the branch members that were here and to the panelists and branch members on Zoom, thank you. Can we get a quick round of applause for everybody for being here? Thank you. And for those that want to talk about permitting for 2 hours, we'll be back here. We'll be back here at 2:30. See you then. Thank you.